Summer 1975. The American labor movement is at a crossroads. Cameras crowd outside union halls and federal courthouses. News anchors speak in urgent tones about racketeering, pension funds, and a powerful union that seems to sit somewhere between democracy and intimidation. In Detroit, the former president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, James R. Hoffa, vanishes on his way to what was supposed to be a routine meeting. The mystery grips the country. It is a story about power, who has it, who wants it, and what they are willing to do to keep it. In the background of that tension, one name begins to surface in investigative files and whispered conversations: Sally Bugs Briguglio. To the public, he is almost invisible, a face occasionally caught by a news photographer, a name buried in court transcripts. To people inside the world of New Jersey trucking and underworld politics, he is something else. A feared organizer, an efficient problem solver, a man whose loyalty to his superiors seems unshakable. The journey that brings him to that moment is not one of sudden transformation, but a slow, incremental shaping by neighborhood, by work, by the particular pressures of mid-20th century America. To understand how a quiet man from the New Jersey waterfront becomes a symbol of that dark intersection between organized labor and organized crime, the story has to begin decades earlier, on the crowded streets that raised him. Public records and contemporary reporting agree on only the broadest outlines of Salvatore Briguglio's early years. He was born in the early 1930s, probably around 1930 or 1931, in Hudson County, New Jersey, in the dense urban sprawl that stretches along the western edge of the Hudson River. It was a place defined by its nearness to New York City and its distance from its prosperity. Across the water, Manhattan's towers rose as symbols of American ambition. On the Jersey side, working-class families lived in close quarters, their lives tied to the piers, factories, and small shops that kept the region moving. Like many families in that area, the Briguglios were part of a large Italian-American community that had taken root there in the early 20th century. Southern Italian immigrants and their children packed into brick row houses and tenement buildings in Jersey City, Hoboken, Union City, and the surrounding towns. The neighborhoods were loud with street vendors and crowded with children. Stoops doubled as living rooms in the summer heat. English mixed with Sicilian and Neapolitan dialects. Catholic parishes anchored the social calendar, and the family name carried a weight that could be both protective and restrictive. By the time Salvatore was old enough to form memories, the Great Depression had already reshaped America. In Hudson County, the economic downturn meant unstable jobs, irregular pay, and a constant awareness that a missed paycheck could lead to eviction or hunger. Contemporary social surveys from the era described dock workers who were hired by the day, truck drivers who waited on corners hopping to be picked, and factory employees whose hours were cut without warning. Children in these neighborhoods grew up watching adults negotiate precarious arrangements with foremen, ward bosses, and anyone else who could open a door to work. It was in this environment that the power of the union first began to loom large. The International Brotherhood of Teamsters, which had started in the 19th century as a union for horse-drawn wagon drivers, was transforming itself into one of the most powerful labor organizations in the United States. As trucking replaced horse carts and highways cut across the state, the Teamsters' influence expanded rapidly. In a place like Hudson County, where trucking companies, warehouses, and wholesalers lined the streets near the river, the union was more than an advocacy group. It was a gatekeeper to a livelihood. For a boy growing up in those blocks, the contrast was visible. Longshoremen and truck drivers who had a strong union behind them might have steadier work, better wages, and a sense of camaraderie. Those on the outside cycled through odd jobs with little security. In family conversations, in parish halls, in corner bars that served as unofficial job exchanges, the word union carried an aura of protection and leverage. That leverage, however, also attracted people looking for more than just better pay. Historically, The same conditions that made industrial unions powerful also made them vulnerable to infiltration by organized crime. The ports of New York and New Jersey had already seen this pattern in the longshoremen's unions, where mob-connected figures leveraged control over hearing to extract payments and favors. Extortion and favoritism could be woven into the daily operations of a union without leaving obvious traces in the public record. By the mid-20th century, federal officials, journalists, and honest unionists were sounding alarms about the growing influence of organized crime inside the Teamsters, especially in certain locals. In Hudson County, one of the most significant of those locals would be Teamsters Local 560, based in Union City. The local's jurisdiction covered truck drivers and warehouse workers across the northern New Jersey industrial corridor. Its leadership would eventually be dominated by Anthony "Tony Pro" Provenzano, a man with deep ties to the Genovese crime family. When Provenzano rose through the ranks, he built a loyal cadre of associates and enforcers who made sure that his style of leadership went unchallenged. Decades later, Salvatore Briguglio would be firmly identified as one of those trusted lieutenants. The path he took into that inner circle reflects both the opportunities and the pressures of his early environment. The social life of Italian-American neighborhoods in Hudson County during Briguglio's youth was organized along lines that both insulated residents from outside prejudice and sometimes connected them to underworld networks. Italian immigrants and their children had long faced discrimination from mainstream society, stereotyped as inherently criminal, denied certain jobs, and often treated as suspect by law enforcement and political elites. In response, communities built their own internal systems of support: mutual aid societies, parish-based charities, neighborhood clubs, and closely knit extended families. These networks helped people find work, arrange credit, and resolve disputes. At the same time, some of the figures who held influence in those informal systems were connected to organized crime. History shows that in many working-class immigrant neighborhoods, the boundary between a respected neighborhood fixer and a criminal intermediary could be blurred. Someone who could help a neighbor secure a truck route or get a relative hired at the docks might also be involved in illegal gambling, loan sharking, or protection rackets. For a young man trying to rise in that environment, the lesson was clear. Power tended to flow through those who could deliver favors and enforce obligations, whether or not they had an official title. What little is known about the younger Briguglio's early work life is pieced together from later reporting on his career. By the 1960s, he is documented as a business agent for Teamsters Local 560. That position, part labor representative, part field organizer, was central to the daily lives of union members. A business agent handled grievances, monitored job sites, and made sure that workers and employers alike followed the union contract. In practice, in a local dominated by a strongman leadership, the business agent also became the person who enforced discipline, collected dues, and communicated the wishes of the top officers to the rank and file. To reach that role, Briguglio would have had to spend years building connections in the trucking world. It is reasonable to assume, based on typical patterns in the union at that time, that he started closer to the ground level, as a driver, a dock worker, or in some related position, before he was trusted with a more formal leadership job. Trucking in mid-century New Jersey was grueling and unforgiving. Drivers maneuvered heavy vehicles along crowded city streets and early versions of modern highways, often working long hours for pay that did not fully reflect the risk. Warehouses could be dangerous, with minimal attention to safety. The union's appeal lay in offering a measure of stability and representation in this environment. The broader political landscape of Hudson County also shaped the world around him. For decades, the county had been dominated by powerful political machines, most famously under Jersey City Mayor Frank Hague in the first half of the 20th century. Hague's rule blended patronage, intimidation, and social services in a way that left deep marks on local culture. Even after his era, the habits of trading loyalty for protection remained embedded in the political life of the region. For someone climbing the ladder in a union like Local 560, understanding how to navigate machine-style politics, a favor here, a show of force there, was practically a prerequisite. By the late 1940s and 1950s, the post-war economic boom transformed the stakes. The construction of the New Jersey Turnpike and other major roadways turned the state into a vital corridor for moving goods up and down the East Coast. Distribution centers, warehouses, and trucking depots multiplied along what would later be called the New Jersey Industrial Belt. Every truckload of goods meant hours of union work. Every contract with a freight company meant more dues flowing into the local. Control of those contracts, and of the labor force that carried them out, became a valuable commodity in itself. Federal investigations in later decades would describe a system in which union jobs and benefits could be traded for loyalty, where dissenting members might find their assignments drying up, and where employers were pressured to cooperate with the leadership's favored vendors and interests. Into this world stepped Salvatore Briguglio, a man whose name would eventually appear again and again in reports on Teamsters Local 560's most controversial years. Before any of that, though, he was one of many New Jersey Italians trying to turn proximity to the waterfront and the highways into a path out of the insecurity their parents had known. One of the most telling features of Briguglio's rise is that it happens quietly. He does not appear as a headline grabber in the early years of his career. The first time his name begins to appear with any regularity in the press and in the transcripts of court hearings and congressional inquiries is in connection with his role as a Provenzano loyalist, by which point he is already firmly established. That silence in the record before then reflects both the nature of his work and the way power operated in his corner of the labor movement. The most feared men were often not those with the highest public profile, but those whose phone calls got returned, whose presence at a job site made people fall in line. The cultural currents shaping Briguglio's character and choices were not unique to him. Historians of the period point to a series of recurring themes in the lives of men who became enforcers for mob-dominated unions. Many had grown up in environments where physical toughness and the ability to project authority were valued. Pride in family and ethnic identity could sit alongside a deep suspicion of outside authorities, especially law enforcement, which was often seen as biased or corrupt. The informal motto of "don't talk to the police" was reinforced by both community norms and the explicit code of silence cherished by organized crime groups. At the same time, these men often had genuine skills as negotiators and organizers. They knew how to settle disputes on loading docks before they turned into walkouts, how to read the mood in a break room, how to talk to an employer in a way that kept the money flowing but reminded him who really controlled the labor force. It was a mix of soft power and the implied threat of harder consequences. When later witnesses describe Briguglio, they frequently emphasize his calm demeanor and methodical approach. He was not a flamboyant character. He was the type of operative who made things run smoothly for his superiors. By the early 1960s, the national spotlight had begun to turn toward the Teamsters. The union's rapid growth and its aggressive stance under leaders like Jimmy Hoffa made it both powerful and controversial. Senate hearings, such as the famous McClellan Committee in the late 1950s, exposed evidence of corruption and organized crime influence in several Teamster locals. Although Local 560 in New Jersey was not yet the central focus of those inquiries, the patterns they described, intimidation of dissident members, sweetheart deals with employers, misuse of pension and welfare funds, were similar to those that critics would eventually associate with Provenzano's operation. Within this atmosphere of heightened scrutiny, the internal culture of a local like 560 became even more dependent on men who could ensure discipline. Accounts from former members and federal investigators later paint a picture of a hierarchy in which top figures like Provenzano relied on trusted subordinates to maintain control. Business agents and close associates were expected to deliver reliable voting blocks in union elections, to make sure that strike votes went the right way, and to make problems disappear before they attracted too much attention. Salvatore Briguglio would become known as one of the most important of those subordinates. What is clear looking back is that his early adulthood unfolded at the convergence of three powerful forces: the working class struggle for economic security, the expansion of the Teamsters as a national powerhouse, and the steady entrenchment of organized crime in certain pockets of the labor movement. His Italian-American background placed him within a community where organized crime families recruited, but also where honest workers joined unions simply to protect themselves. His presence in Hudson County, with its history of political machines and waterfront corruption, meant that he moved in a landscape where lines between legitimate and illegitimate power were often blurred. By the time investigators and journalists start to take a hard look at Teamsters Local 560, Salvatore Briguglio is no longer just another name on the membership rolls. He is a business agent, an enforcer in the eyes of many who knew the local's operations, and an essential piece in the structure that kept Provenzano's faction in command. The boy raised in the shadow of the Manhattan skyline has become a man whose decisions can shape the fate of truck drivers, warehouse workers, and eventually, some of the most famous figures in American labor history. The public has yet to learn his name in these years, and the historical record leaves many of his private thoughts and motivations a mystery. What can be traced, however, is the tightening circle of power around him, the growing authority he wields on the job sites, the increasing trust placed in him by higher-ups, and the way his work consistently intersects with the darker side of union politics. The conditions of his upbringing, the economic insecurity, the tight-knit neighborhood, the presence of both legitimate organizers and criminal influencers, have done their work. He stands on the threshold of a period in which his actions will no longer be confined to the quiet spaces of union offices and warehouse yards, but will instead intersect with some of the most notorious conflicts of his era, leaving a trail of allegations and investigations that will follow his name long after his death. As the 1960s opened, the world around Salvatore Briguglio was in motion. America was entering a decade of protest and transformation, but on the industrial streets of northern New Jersey, change looked less like marches and slogans, and more like new contracts, new trucking depots, and new channels of money. The highways that carved their way through the state turned it into a vital artery for goods moving between the ports and the rest of the country. In that environment, the Teamsters Union was not just one institution among many. It was the central gatekeeper of who would profit from this growth and on what terms. Inside that gatekeeping structure, Teamsters Local 560 in Union City occupied a special place. It controlled thousands of jobs across trucking companies, warehouses, and freight handlers in one of the most strategically important stretches of industrial land in the United States. By this time, Local 560 was firmly under the influence of Anthony "Tony Pro" Provenzano, a man whose name already carried weight far beyond New Jersey. Provenzano was both a powerful Teamsters leader and a recognized figure within the Genovese crime family, one of New York's most entrenched organized crime organizations. Federal and state investigations would eventually describe Local 560 under his rule as a model of how mob-connected officials could dominate a union. Within that world, Salvatore "Sally Bugs" Briguglio emerged not as a fiery speechmaker or a public negotiator, but as a quietly efficient operator. By the early 1960s, he was serving as a business agent for Local 560, a role that placed him at the center of daily contact between the rank-and-file membership and the leadership circle around Provenzano. Business agents were the union's eyes and ears on the street. They visited work sites, handled grievances, ensured dues were collected, and enforced the leadership's will in matters large and small. When members wanted answers about assignments, overtime, or benefits, it was often the business agent they dealt with first. When the leadership wanted pressure applied, subtle or otherwise, it was often the business agent who delivered it. Contemporaries later described Briguglio as a man who thrived in that intermediary space. Unlike Provenzano, whose name became well known even to people outside the labor world, Briguglio preferred to remain just out of the spotlight. He dressed like other union officials, attended meetings, and presented himself as a serious, businesslike representative. There was nothing in his manner that shouted for attention. Yet among local 560 members, his presence on a loading dock or in a terminal office sent a clear signal that the leadership was paying attention. He was not the only business agent, nor the only tough enforcer in the Provenzano orbit, but over time he became one of the most trusted. The nickname Sally Bugs, which would follow him into FBI files and media reports, attached itself somewhere along this rise. The exact origin remains uncertain, and different accounts offer different explanations. Some say it had to do with his sharp, watchful eyes. Others hint at a more private joke from within the crew. What matters for history is that the nickname served as a kind of brand in Union City and beyond. When members spoke of Sally Bugs, they were not talking about a neighborhood character. They meant the business agent with access to Tony Pro, the man whose opinion could affect a driver's route or a dock worker's schedule. In the early 1960s, the internal politics of Local 560 took a violent turn that would cast a long shadow over Briguglio's life. One of the key figures in these struggles was Anthony "Tony" Casalito, the local secretary-treasurer. Casalito had been an ally of Provenzano and a key part of the local's leadership structure. Over time, however, tensions grew between them. As in many power struggles inside mob-influenced unions, the dispute mixed personal grievances, financial disagreements, and competing ambitions for control of the local's assets and influence. On July 5, 1961, Casalito left his home in Bergen County, New Jersey, and never returned. His disappearance puzzled investigators from the start. There was no public evidence of a robbery gone wrong or a personal dispute that might explain his vanishing. For years, the case remained officially unsolved, but in labor circles and law enforcement offices alike, suspicion immediately fell on the Provenzano camp. Casalito had been a high-ranking officer in a notoriously hard-line union local, in conflict with a leader whose reputation for ruthlessness was already a subject of intense law enforcement interest. It did not take much imagination for investigators to assume that his disappearance was connected to internal union politics. For a long time, however, no one could prove it. The lack of a body, the code of silence that surrounded Local 560, and the general climate of fear kept potential witnesses quiet. What lay behind Casalito's disappearance would only fully emerge in the 1970s, when a former Provenzano associate named Ralph Picardo agreed to cooperate with authorities. Picardo told investigators that Casalito had been killed on Provenzano's orders, and that Salvatore Briguglio had been one of the key participants. According to Picardo's later testimony, Casalito was lured to a house, killed there, and his remains disposed of in a way that ensured they would not be found. Picardo's account would lead to state murder charges against Provenzano and Briguglio many years after the event. At the time it happened, though, Casalito's disappearance offered a chilling lesson to anyone in Local 560 who might have considered challenging the Provenzano leadership. With one of the local's top officers gone and no one held immediately accountable, the message was clear: opposition could simply vanish. In the years that followed, Provenzano consolidated his hold on the local, and men like Briguglio, who had proven their loyalty, became even more central to the functioning of that system. While these internal dramas were unfolding in Union City, The broader Teamsters organization was attracting unprecedented national scrutiny. Jimmy Hoffa, who became president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters in 1957, was in many ways the embodiment of union power for the American public. Charismatic, combative, and fiercely protective of his members, Hoffa also embraced alliances and tactics that drew increasing concern from reformers and law enforcement. The famous McClellan Committee hearings of the late 1950s had already exposed patterns of corruption and mob influence in parts of the Teamsters. Hoffa denied many of the most serious allegations, but the hearings cemented his image as a man operating in a morally gray zone. Local 560 under Tony Pro was a crucial part of Hoffa's power base. Provenzano served as a Teamsters vice president and a close ally. To maintain that alliance, Hoffa needed the New Jersey local's support in national union politics, and Provenzano, in turn, received considerable autonomy in running his own domain. That arrangement created an environment in which figures like Briguglio could operate with a sense of protection. So long as the local delivered votes, dues, and labor peace when the international leadership needed it, Washington was unlikely to intervene aggressively in its internal affairs. Law enforcement, however, was another matter. Through the 1960s, the FBI and various state agencies deepened their efforts to map and disrupt organized crime networks. The Bureau's organized crime program, formalized after the 1957 Appalachian meeting, exposed the national scale of the American mafia, placed increasing emphasis on the intersection of unions and mob families. Local 560, with its combination of economic importance and reputed mob connections, was an obvious subject of interest. Over time, FBI reports, internal documents that cataloged what agents learned from surveillance, informants, and other sources, began to list Salvatore Briguglio as a significant associate of the Genovese family and a lieutenant in the Provenzano faction. Inside the Union, Briguglio's day-to-day activities reflected the blend of legitimate and illegitimate power that defined Local 560's reputation. On the most basic level, he handled grievances, disputes over work assignments, claims of unpaid overtime, questions about seniority. A skilled business agent could present himself as a problem solver, the person who could cut through red tape and get things done. At the same time, in a union environment shaped by organized crime, the resolution of those problems was rarely neutral. Members who aligned themselves with the leadership could find their issues handled swiftly. Those who complained too loudly supported rival factions, or spoke to investigators might discover that their calls went unanswered, their preferred routes reassigned, or their job security suddenly precarious. Employers dealt with the same dynamic from the opposite side. Officials later testified that some companies were pressured to make payments, officially or unofficially, in exchange for a smooth relationship with the union. The threat did not need to be spelled out in dramatic terms. Everyone understood that a strike, a wave of grievances, or a sudden outbreak of problems on the loading dock could be costly. In that environment, a quiet conversation with a business agent or union officer, perhaps someone like Briguglio, offering a way to ensure stability could be extremely persuasive. Federal charges later brought against Provenzano, Briguglio, and their associates would describe schemes in which employers paid to avoid labor disruptions, to receive favorable contract terms, or simply to stay on the right side of Local 560. As the decade progressed, the line between labor leadership and criminal enterprise became increasingly central to how outsiders understood Local 560. Inside the local, however, many members still saw the union primarily through the lens of what it delivered: wages, pensions, health benefits, and protection against arbitrary treatment by employers. Some members undoubtedly feared or resented the methods used by the Provenzano camp, but others viewed them as simply the cost of having a strong union in a tough industry. In interviews years later, former members would recall a mixture of admiration and unease toward men like Briguglio. Admiration for their effectiveness in getting results, unease about the rumors of violence and intimidation that seemed to follow them. The federal legal framework was slowly catching up to these realities. The Labor Management Reporting and Disclosure Act of 1959, often called the Landrum-Griffin Act, was designed in part to promote transparency and democracy in unions after the McClellan hearings. It required detailed financial reporting and set rules for internal elections. In theory, these provisions made it harder for corrupt officials to misuse union funds or rig votes. In practice, in locals dominated by entrenched, mob-connected leaderships, the law often proved difficult to enforce. Members who might have challenged suspicious practices faced the same climate of fear that surrounded other forms of dissent. Nevertheless, Landrum-Griffin and other reforms provided new tools for prosecutors. Over the course of the 1960s, federal authorities brought a series of cases against Teamsters figures across the country, including some in New Jersey. Provenzano himself was convicted in the mid-1960s on extortion charges related to payments demanded from employers. He was later sentenced to a term in federal prison. That conviction did not break his hold on Local 560. Instead, it forced him to manage his domain from a distance, relying on trusted lieutenants to carry out his will. Among those lieutenants were Salvatore Briguglio and Briguglio's brother, Gabriel, who was also active in the local. This period tested Briguglio's ability to operate under pressure. With Provenzano behind bars, federal agents intensified their efforts to probe the local's internal workings. The FBI cultivated informants among rank-and-file members and low-level associates. Wiretaps and surveillance tried to capture the flow of information and instructions from prison to the streets. To keep the machine running smoothly, men like Briguglio had to maintain discipline, reassure allies, and discourage anyone tempted to cooperate with authorities. The precise conversations and decisions of those years are mostly lost to history, preserved only in fragmentary FBI reports and the recollections of a few later witnesses. But what is clear is that Briguglio's stature within the Provenzano camp continued to grow rather than diminish. He also began to attract more direct legal attention. By the end of the 1960s and early 1970s, his name appeared as a defendant in federal indictments that targeted labor racketeering and extortion in New Jersey. These cases often followed a familiar pattern. Prosecutors alleged that Briguglio and other union officials had pressured companies to make improper payments in exchange for avoiding strikes, reducing the risk of grievances, or securing contracts on favorable terms. Defense lawyers, in turn, argued that their clients were simply engaged in tough but legitimate bargaining, the kind of hard-nosed negotiation that unions were born to conduct. Public reporting from the period shows that not every legal effort against Briguglio succeeded. Some cases ended in acquittals or reduced charges, others dragged on through appeals. In the world of organized crime and corrupt labor relations, this was not unusual. Prosecutors struggled with reluctant witnesses, complex paper trails, and the challenge of persuading juries to convict men who could plausibly wrap themselves in the mantle of defending workers' rights. Each time Briguglio walked out of a courtroom without a long prison sentence, his reputation for being difficult to nail down grew. At the same time, the cumulative effect of these investigations solidified his public image, at least among those following the story closely. To journalists covering organized crime, to labor reformers trying to clean up union politics, and to federal agents assigned to the Teamsters beat, Sally Bugs, Briguglio was no longer merely a name on Local 560's organizational chart. He was a symbol of a particular kind of figure at the intersection of labor and the mob, the enforcer-organizer whose loyalty to a dominant boss underpinned an entire system of control. The broader social landscape of the late 1960s and early 1970s only heightened the contrast between this entrenched world and the country's changing values. While students marched against the Vietnam War and activists pressed for civil rights and government transparency, institutions like Local 560 appeared almost frozen in an earlier era of machine politics and backroom deals. Yet the economic importance of the Union and the genuine benefits it continued to deliver to many members made it hard to dislodge. So did the willingness of men like Briguglio to use every tool at their disposal, from personal persuasion to overt intimidation, to keep challenges in check. By the early 1970s, the lines of conflict that would define the last years of Briguglio's life were firmly drawn. He was a seasoned business agent, deeply embedded in Provenzano's power structure, with a history of surviving legal challenges and a reputation for being both efficient and formidable. Federal and state investigators saw him as a crucial piece of the puzzle in understanding labor racketeering in New Jersey. Within the Teamsters world, he was known as one of the key figures ensuring that Tony Pro's influence remained intact, even as prison sentences and political shifts reshaped the national leadership. What none of the people around him could fully foresee was how the next set of conflicts, centered on James R. Hoffa, on long-simmering rivalries within the Teamsters, and on renewed efforts by law enforcement to turn insiders into witnesses, would pull Briguglio into the center of some of the most contested and enduring mysteries in American labor history. For the moment, he moved through the warehouses and union halls of northern New Jersey much as he always had, quietly, efficiently, and with an authority that seemed, at least to those who had to deal with him, beyond question. By the early 1970s, the pressure around Salvatore Briguglio was tightening, even as his authority inside Teamsters Local 560 seemed as solid as ever. The American economy was shifting. Deindustrialization was beginning to hollow out older manufacturing centers. Inflation was gnawing at wages, and long-established bargaining arrangements were under strain. In that unsettled landscape, control of a powerful trucking local in northern New Jersey was more valuable than ever. Freight still had to move, no matter what happened to factories, and whoever spoke for the truckers who hauled that freight held a crucial lever over employers, politicians, and, in some cases, organized crime families. For the federal government, the intersection of those forces had become a central concern. RICO, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, passed in 1970, gave prosecutors new tools to go after entire criminal enterprises instead of just individual crimes. The Justice Department created specialized organized crime strike forces that pooled investigators, prosecutors, and intelligence across agencies. On their list of priority targets were mafia-linked labor racketeering networks, especially those inside the Teamsters. Local 560, which the FBI viewed as a stronghold of the Genovese family's New Jersey faction, was near the top of that list. In bureau reports, the names of Anthony Tony Provenzano and his trusted lieutenant, Salvatore Sally Bugs Briguglio, appeared again and again. To understand why they mattered so much to federal investigators, it is necessary to trace the other great figure looming over this story, James R. Hoffa. For years, Hoffa and Provenzano had been allies. Hoffa depended on men like Tony Pro to deliver support from key locals such as 560, and Provenzano in turn gained national influence and cover for his tight grip on the New Jersey membership. They shared more than politics, they shared legal trouble. In the 1960s, as federal prosecutors turned up the heat on the Teamsters, both men were convicted on serious charges. Hoffa was found guilty of jury tampering and fraud in 1964 and sentenced to prison. What had been an alliance began to unravel there. Accounts from other prisoners and later testimony paint a picture of a relationship that turned bitter, culminating in a confrontation in the prison yard. The details differ depending on who tells the story. Some say the argument involved unpaid support for Provenzano's family while Hoffa was free. Others point to a dispute over authority inside the Union, but the result was clear. By the time they left Louisburg, Hoffa and Tony Pro were no longer friends. They were rivals whose feud was known throughout the Teamsters hierarchy and among the underworld figures who had long used the Union as a source of money and influence. When President Richard Nixon commuted Hoffa's sentence in December 1971, the terms of that commutation barred him from engaging in Union activities until 1980. Hoffa accepted the deal publicly, but made little effort to hide his intention to challenge it. He wanted his old job back. The international presidency of the Teamsters, which he had been forced to relinquish after his conviction, was now held by Frank Fitzsimmons, a less confrontational figure who had cultivated good relations with the Nixon administration and with organized crime interests that preferred a more pliable leader. Hoffa's determination to return threatened not only Fitzsimmons, but also the carefully balanced arrangements that figures like Provenzano had established within their domains. In that emerging struggle, Local 560 was a crucial battleground. Control of one of the most powerful trucking locals in the country meant control of delegates at national union conventions, political contributions, and a significant block of votes in any serious leadership challenge. Tony Pro made no secret of his opposition to Hoffa's comeback. For Hoffa to regain the presidency, he would need either to break Provenzano's grip on New Jersey or to find a way to neutralize him. Either path risked igniting conflicts that went far beyond normal Union politics. On the ground in Union City, that high-level power struggle filtered down into the daily work of men like Salvatore Briguglio. As Provenzano's trusted business agent, Briguglio was both gatekeeper and guard dog. He helped ensure that Local 560's official positions aligned with Tony Pro's wishes, that dissident voices were kept marginal, and that contact with outside factions, including any operatives seeking support for Hoffa, was monitored and, if necessary, discouraged. To members, he might appear simply as the official who processed grievances or represented them in contract talks. To those closer to the leadership, he was part of the inner circle that defended the Provenzano camp against all threats, internal and external. The federal government saw things in similar terms, but from the opposite side. By the early 1970s, organized crime strike forces were piecing together a picture of interconnected relationships. New Jersey Teamster officials tied to the Genovese family, Detroit mob figures with deep interests in Teamster pension funds, and Hoffa's allies and enemies scattered across key locals. Strike force memos described Salvatore Briguglio as a principal lieutenant to Provenzano and a suspected participant in violent acts used to maintain control. The still unsolved 1961 disappearance of Local 560 officer Anthony Casalito remained a nagging question for investigators, as did a series of beatings and threats against dissident members and uncooperative employers. Briguglio was not just a subject of surveillance, he was an active defendant. Through the early 1970s, federal prosecutors brought a string of labor racketeering and extortion cases involving Local 560 officials. One major indictment charged that Provenzano, Briguglio, and others had forced trucking companies to make improper payments under threat of strikes and labor disruptions. Witnesses described a pattern in which union officials used the possibility of labor trouble as leverage, blurring the line between hard bargaining and criminal coercion. The defense countered that this was simply the rough and tumble world of industrial relations, that strong unions necessarily pressured employers, and that the government was criminalizing legitimate worker advocacy. Court records from the period show that Briguglio spent a significant portion of these years in and out of federal courtrooms, sitting beside his attorneys as prosecutors laid out their charges. He consistently pleaded not guilty and, in public, showed little emotion as witnesses took the stand. The outcomes of these cases varied. Some counts resulted in convictions that were challenged on appeal. Others ended in acquittals or mistrials. But the cumulative effect was to place his name firmly on the radar of anyone following the story of corruption in the Teamsters. To law enforcement, he now appeared not only as a behind-the-scenes enforcer, but also as a man who had repeatedly tested, and so far survived, the criminal justice system. The federal campaign against Local 560, however, gained a new and potent weapon in the mid-1970s, a cooperating insider. Ralph, Little Ralphie, Picardo had moved in the same orbit as Provenzano and Briguglio, part of the rough cadre that straddled the line between union work and underworld operations. By the early 1970s, Picardo himself was in serious legal trouble, serving time in New Jersey for homicide unrelated to the union. Facing a long sentence and uncertain about his future, he made a decision that would reverberate through multiple investigations. He agreed to talk. In late 1974 and 1975, Picardo met repeatedly with FBI agents and New Jersey state investigators. The Bureau's internal memoranda, later quoted in court proceedings and media reports, summarize what he said: that the disappearance of Anthony Casalito in 1961 had not been a mystery at all within the Provenzano organization, that Casalito had been lured to his death on orders from Tony Pro, and that Salvatore Briguglio had played a central role in carrying out the killing and disposing of the body. Picardo claimed to have been drawn into the plot at the edges, helping to facilitate meetings and later learning details of what had happened. Crucially, Picardo also went beyond the Casalito case. He told investigators that Provenzano and his New Jersey associates had discussed Jimmy Hoffa in deeply hostile terms. According to FBI accounts of his statements, Picardo claimed that while he was in custody, he heard from sources within the Provenzano circle that Hoffa had been taken care of by a team that included New Jersey men. Among the names he mentioned was Salvatore "Sally Bugs" Briguglio. In Picardo's telling, Briguglio was not just an administrative enforcer, but a man capable of carrying out lethal assignments when ordered. These were explosive allegations, and investigators treated them with a mixture of eagerness and caution. On the one hand, Picardo was offering exactly what they had long lacked: an insider narrative connecting specific individuals to specific acts of violence. On the other hand, he was a convicted felon with obvious motives to curry favor, reduce his sentence, or gain protection. Before building major cases around his testimony, prosecutors needed corroboration, details that could be checked against independent evidence, timelines, phone records, and other witnesses. Even with those caveats, Picardo's cooperation transformed the landscape. In New Jersey, his statements about the Casalito disappearance provided the foundation for new state charges against Anthony Provenzano, Salvatore Briguglio, and other associates in the mid-1970s. For the first time, the 1961 case was formally recast not as an unexplained missing person file, but as an alleged contract killing rooted in a union power struggle. Grand juries heard testimony, indictments were issued, and the legal noose around Provenzano's circle tightened further. Briguglio, who had already faced federal extortion charges, now had to contend with the possibility of a state murder trial as well. On the Hoffa front, Picardo's disclosures were equally significant, though more difficult to translate into formal charges. Jimmy Hoffa vanished on July 30, 1975, after leaving his home near Detroit for what he believed was a meeting with Tony Provenzano and Detroit mob figure Anthony Giacalone at the Match's Red Fox restaurant in suburban Bloomfield Township. When Hoffa failed to return home, his family contacted authorities. His car was later found in the restaurant parking lot, but no definitive trace of Hoffa himself was ever recovered. The disappearance instantly became one of the biggest news stories in the country, symbolizing for many Americans the hidden power of organized crime and its entanglement with labor. From the moment Hoffa went missing, the FBI suspected a conspiracy involving organized crime figures who saw his attempted comeback as a threat. Investigators quickly focused on the Detroit underworld and on the Provenzano faction in New Jersey. Travel records, phone logs, and informant reports were scrutinized for any hint that New Jersey associates had been summoned to Detroit or involved in planning or carrying out the disappearance. Within this framework, Picardo's claim that Briguglio had been named to him as a participant in the plot took on special weight. Yet here, too, the evidentiary challenges were immense. Briguglio denied any involvement in Hoffa's disappearance, and despite years of intensive investigation, he was never charged in connection with the case. Some accounts suggest that he could point to an alibi placing him in the New York, New Jersey area at the time. Others note that the FBI remained unconvinced by such defenses. What is certain is that federal agents placed him under heavy surveillance, tracked his movements, and repeatedly sought to question him about both Hoffa and Casalito. He declined to cooperate, often invoking his constitutional rights before grand juries and in other formal settings. The climate around him grew increasingly intense. Newspaper stories in the mid and late 1970s, drawing on law enforcement leaks and court filings, began to portray Salvatore "Sally Bugs" Briguglio as one of the most feared men in the Provenzano organization, a suspected hitman, a fixer, a man whose name surfaced in connection with two of the most notorious criminal mysteries of the era. For years, he had operated as a relatively obscure business agent known mainly to Teamsters and investigators. Now he found himself portrayed, fairly or not, as a central figure in a national drama over union corruption and organized crime. This notoriety did not translate into a stable or secure life. The combination of ongoing prosecutions, surveillance, and internal underworld tensions made Briguglio's position precarious. He faced serious prison time if convicted in the Casalito case or in any of the remaining federal racketeering matters. At the same time, the very investigations that threatened him also created incentives for others in the underworld to talk, to shift blame, or to preemptively silence those who might be tempted to cooperate. The mid-1970s were a period in which the old certainties of mafia dominated labor racketeering were breaking down under legal pressure. And in that breakdown, men who had once been protected by their usefulness could suddenly find themselves exposed. In New Jersey and beyond, the legal proceedings connected to Local 560 continued to unfold. Prosecutors pressed ahead with their Casalito murder case, using Picardo as a key witness and layering in whatever corroboration they could find. Appeals courts reviewed older extortion convictions linked to Provenzano's circle. Within the Teamsters, reformers and outside monitors increasingly cited Local 560 as an example of what went wrong when violent intimidation and mob alliances were allowed to take root inside a union. Later civil actions by the Justice Department would ultimately use these patterns to justify an unprecedented attempt to place Local 560 under court-supervised trusteeship. But in the mid-1970s, those outcomes were still in the future. For Salvatore Briguglio, the present was more immediate and personal. Constant meetings with lawyers, regular appearances in court, unmarked cars that seemed to be watching wherever he went, and the knowledge that his name was being discussed in law enforcement offices from Newark to Washington and Detroit. The quiet business agent who had once walked loading docks as Provenzano's emissary now moved through a world where every step carried risk of indictment, risk of betrayal, and increasingly, risk from within the underworld, whose code of silence he had long honored. The stage was set for the final, violent chapter of his life, one that would unfold in parallel with the still unsolved mystery of Jimmy Hoffa, and would leave both law enforcement officials and the public with more questions than answers about what, exactly, Salvatore "Sally Bugs" Briguglio had done, and what he knew. In the middle years of the 1970s, the larger story of labor, organized crime, and federal power converged even more tightly around Salvatore Salvatore Briguglio. What had once been a largely local world of trucking yards, union halls, and backroom deals in northern New Jersey was now entangled with national scandals and some of the most high-profile investigations in American law enforcement history. Each new development, Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance, the emergence of insider witnesses, the expansion of federal racketeering laws, added another layer of scrutiny to the life of a man who, a decade earlier, had been mostly invisible outside of his own circle. In the summer of 1975, Hoffa vanished on his way to what he believed would be a meeting with Tony Provenzano and Detroit mobster Anthony Giacallo. Within hours, FBI agents and local police in Michigan were mobilized. Within days, the investigation had spread eastward, reaching into the familiar geography of Salvatore Briguglio's life, the trucking depots of New Jersey, the Teamsters' halls of Union City, the social clubs of New York's Little Italy. Federal agents pulled his phone records, tracked his movements, and looked for any sign that he or his associates had traveled to Detroit around the time Hoffa disappeared. Inside the FBI, a summary document known as the Hoffa's memo consolidated what investigators believed they knew about the disappearance. It listed probable motives and likely suspects, reflecting the Bureau's assessment that organized crime figures opposed to Hoffa's attempted comeback had orchestrated the crime. Among the names associated with the New Jersey side of the case were Anthony Provenzano and several of his close associates. Salvatore "Sally Bugs" Briguglio, already prominent in FBI files because of his role in Local 560 and his alleged involvement in earlier violence, was now identified as a significant figure of interest. None of this meant that the government could prove a case against him in court. No body, no direct physical evidence, and the complex web of hearsay on which so many organized crime investigations depended all made prosecution extraordinarily difficult. But it did mean that, from 1975 onward, he moved under an even harsher glare. The Hoffa investigation was not a quiet affair. It played out on the front pages of newspapers and in nightly television reports. Photographs of Hoffa's empty car, maps of the Detroit suburbs, and graphics tracing alleged underworld connections became familiar features of the news. As the story broadened, journalists began to explore the world of Hoffa's longtime allies and enemies, including Tony Pro's New Jersey operation. Local 560, once known mainly to its members and to those doing business along the New Jersey industrial belt, became a synonym in public discourse for the darker side of the Teamsters. Reporters introduced viewers to a cast of characters that included Hoffa, Provenzano, and the man many of them now called by his underworld nickname, Sally Bugs. Even before Hoffa's disappearance, state and federal authorities had been steadily increasing their pressure on Provenzano's circle. The Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, or RICO, had been passed in 1970 as a way to target criminal enterprises by linking individual crimes to broader patterns of racketeering activity. For prosecutors focused on labor racketeering, this law was a potential game changer. Instead of treating each case of extortion, embezzlement, or violence as a separate incident, they could attempt to show that these acts formed part of an ongoing criminal enterprise. Local 560, with its mix of economic clout, organized crime links, and a history of alleged intimidation, seemed a textbook example of the kind of structure RICO was designed to confront. Rumors about who had ordered and carried out the killing were common in law enforcement circles, but until the mid-1970s, no one had provided enough detail for prosecutors to act. That changed when Little Ralphie, Picardo began cooperating with authorities. A one-time associate in the Provenzano orbit, Picardo had his own criminal record and reasons to seek leniency. Nevertheless, when he sat down with FBI agents and New Jersey investigators, The information he offered was more specific than anything they had previously obtained. He alleged that Casalito's disappearance had been a deliberate killing, organized to resolve a power struggle within Local 560, and he named names. According to court records and investigative summaries, Picardo identified Anthony Provenzano as the man who ordered the hit and placed Salvatore, Sally Bugs, Briguglio among those who had participated in carrying it out and disposing of the body. Picardo's account did not remain locked away in confidential reports. It formed the backbone of new state murder charges. In the mid-1970s, New Jersey prosecutors obtained indictments against Provenzano and several associates, including Briguglio, in connection with the Casalito case. For the first time, the 1961 disappearance was being presented formally in court as a murder conspiracy rooted in union politics. The charges alleged that Casalito had been lured under false pretenses, killed, and secretly buried, all to remove him as a rival in Local 560's leadership and to consolidate control for the Provenzano faction. Briguglio, through his attorneys, firmly denied any involvement. In pretrial motions and public comments, his defense team attacked Picardo's credibility, highlighting his criminal history and his obvious incentive to say whatever might earn him favorable treatment. They argued that the state's case relied heavily on the uncorroborated word of a man who had every reason to shift blame away from himself and onto others. Where prosecutors saw a long-delayed breakthrough, the defense saw a dangerous willingness to build murder charges around the testimony of a single cooperating felon. The legal proceedings moved slowly, as major organized crime cases often do. Investigators sifted through old files, looking for any scraps of evidence that could support Picardo's narrative. Phone records, travel documents, accounts from other witnesses who might recall the events around July 1961. New Jersey's political and legal establishment watched closely. A successful prosecution would validate years of concern about Local 560 and send a signal that the state could, at last, confront the lethal side of labor racketeering. For the defendants, the stakes were obvious. A conviction in the Casalito case would likely mean spending the rest of their lives in prison. Meanwhile, the federal campaign against corruption in the Teamsters continued on its own tracks. Grand juries in Detroit, New Jersey, and elsewhere subpoenaed union officials and suspected mob associates, seeking testimony about both the Hoffa disappearance and broader patterns of extortion and intimidation. Salvatore Briguglio found himself summoned repeatedly. In these settings, he followed a path well worn by others in his position. He invoked his constitutional right against self-incrimination. Transcripts from grand jury sessions and legislative hearings show him responding to question after question, with variations of the same phrase, declining to answer on the grounds that his words could be used against him in criminal proceedings. For the public, such performances became an emblem of a certain kind of power. Viewers watching televised hearings could see a middle-aged man in a suit, neither a flamboyant gangster nor a polished politician, sit at a table and refuse to engage with senators or prosecutors. His silence spoke loudly to those who already believed that the Teamsters and the Mafia were deeply intertwined. To others, it raised questions about due process and the limits of congressional and prosecutorial power. In any case, each appearance reinforced his notoriety. Sally Bugs, once a name known mainly in New Jersey trucking circles, was now associated with some of the era's most highly publicized criminal controversies. Inside Local 560, the pressure from outside did not automatically translate into reform. The local remained under the effective sway of the Provenzano camp, even as Tony Pro himself cycled in and out of prison on various federal charges. Business agents like Briguglio continued to manage grievances, negotiate with employers, and oversee day-to-day operations. Many rank-and-file members still relied on the union for wages, benefits, and protection from arbitrary treatment on the job. For them, the abstract talk of RICO statutes and grand juries often took a back seat to the concrete questions of whether the contract would be honored and whether healthcare coverage would remain intact. Yet the atmosphere was changing. Some members grew bolder in voicing criticism, aided by the sense that the government was finally serious about challenging entrenched leaderships. A few went on record with state investigators, describing what they saw as patterns of favoritism, threats, and in some cases, outright assaults against those who stepped out of line. Their accounts appeared in investigative reports and later in civil complaints brought by the federal government against the local. These were dangerous acts. Testifying against Local 560's leadership meant not only risking workplace retaliation, but also potentially provoking the anger of people with reputations for using more direct methods of enforcement. In this environment, Salvatore Briguglio occupied a fraught position. To the men who had long depended on Provenzano's leadership, he was a key loyalist, someone who could be counted on to carry out orders and maintain discipline. To dissidents, he represented precisely the kind of hard-line presence that made open opposition so risky. To law enforcement, he was both a suspect and a potential source of information, a man who, if he ever chose to cooperate, could shed light on unsolved crimes and ongoing racketeering schemes. This combination of roles made him both valuable and vulnerable. One of the features of the mid-1970s underworld was a growing recognition that the old code of silence was eroding. Laws like RICO increased the potential penalties for organized crime figures, making life sentences more common. At the same time, the Federal Witness Protection Program offered a way out for those willing to testify. High-profile mob cases around the country showed that even seasoned criminals could, under enough pressure, decide to cooperate. For organizations built on loyalty enforced by fear, this was a profound threat. One way to manage that threat was to find and neutralize anyone who might be tempted to talk. Whether or not Salvatore Briguglio ever seriously considered cooperating with authorities remains uncertain. No public record has surfaced in which he expresses such an intention. Prosecutors have said that they regarded him as a potential target for a cooperation agreement, given the amount of information he might possess, especially about the Casalito case, and possibly about Hoffa's disappearance. Some later media reports and retrospective accounts claim that he was, at the very least, under pressure from law enforcement to break ranks. His refusal to answer questions and his continued public alignment with the Provenzano camp suggest that he did not, in fact, take that step. But in the climate of the time, suspicion alone could be enough to put someone in danger. Outside the courtroom and the Union Hall, Briguglio's life followed patterns common to many men in his position. He remained based in New Jersey, but moved frequently through the dense network of social clubs, restaurants, and meeting places that linked the state's industrial cities to New York's Little Italy. One of the most notable of these was the Andrea Doria Social Club on Mulberry Street in Manhattan, a venue associated in press and police reports with the Genovese family. It was a place where business could be discussed under the cover of casual conversation, where messages could be passed in person rather than over tapped phones, and where men like Briguglio could maintain their connections to the broader underworld network that sustained their power. Journalists who covered organized crime in those years sometimes staked out such clubs, hopping to glimpse and photograph the figures they wrote about. In grainy black and white images from the period, men in dark coats can be seen entering and leaving storefronts whose signage gives little clue of what happens inside. To the casual passerby, these places might appear to be just another bar or neighborhood association. To law enforcement, they were important nodes in the web of relationships they were trying to map. For Salvatore Briguglio, they were part of the fabric of daily life, a place to meet allies, receive instructions, and demonstrate that, despite the mounting legal pressure, he remained within the fold. As the decade moved toward its close, the weight on his shoulders increased. The Casalito murder indictment remained unresolved, hanging over him with the prospect of a trial that could expose him to a life sentence if convicted. The federal investigations into Hoffa's disappearance and related racketeering continued, with his name never far from investigators' minds, even if it had not yet produced specific charges against him. Each legal challenge meant more meetings with lawyers, more strategy sessions about how to respond to subpoenas and questions, more calculations about the risks of testifying versus remaining silent. The public narrative about him grew steadily darker. In articles and books about the Hoffa case and Teamsters corruption, writers frequently referred to Salvatore "Sally Bugs" Briguglio as an alleged hitman, a key player in both the internal violence that maintained control of Local 560 and possibly in the plot that removed Hoffa. Careful journalists noted the difference between allegation and proof, reminding readers that he had not been convicted of murder and had never been charged in connection with Hoffa. Nonetheless, the repetition of his name in such contexts shaped how he was perceived by a generation of readers and viewers. For Briguglio himself, the world must have seemed to be closing in, even if we cannot know his private thoughts. He was balancing on a narrow ledge between legal danger and underworld suspicion, deeply tied to a power structure that was under unprecedented assault from law enforcement. Any move he made, any sign of wavering loyalty, any misstep in handling his legal cases, risked being interpreted, rightly or wrongly, as a prelude to cooperation. At the same time, simply staying the course meant facing the possibility of dying in prison if a jury accepted the state's account of the Casalito murder, or if federal prosecutors eventually brought a successful racketeering case against him. By early 1978, that tension had reached a breaking point. In New Jersey, preparations continued for what promised to be a major trial in the Casalito case, with Ralph Picardo slated to testify in detail about the events of 1961 and the alleged roles of each defendant. In the broader world of organized crime and labor racketeering, the sense that the old arrangements were under assault had never been stronger. It was in this fraught moment, under indictment, under surveillance, and under the constant, unseen gaze of both law enforcement agencies and mob leaders wary of betrayal, that Salvatore "Sally Bugs" Briguglio walked the familiar streets of Lower Manhattan, unaware that his own story was about to come to a sudden and violent end, and that his death would become one more unsolved piece of the larger puzzle surrounding the Teamsters, Hoffa, and the reach of organized crime in American public life. March 1978 was chilly in New York, the kind of damp cold that lingered in the narrow streets of Lower Manhattan well into the evenings. Little Italy, with its mix of old tenement buildings, restaurants, and social clubs, looked much as it had for decades. For men connected to the New Jersey waterfront and trucking world, Mulberry Street was familiar ground, a place to eat, to talk, and to conduct business away from the more obvious gaze of New Jersey law enforcement. Among the storefronts was the Andrea Doria Social Club, a modest, unassuming address that appeared in the notebooks of FBI agents as a gathering spot for figures associated with the Genovese crime family. It was there, on the night of March 21, 1978, that Salvatore "Sally Bugs" Briguglio's life abruptly ended. The basic facts are not in dispute. That evening, Briguglio visited the club as he had many times before. He was 47 years old, living under the cloud of serious criminal accusations. In New Jersey, he remained under indictment in the state's long-delayed case alleging that Anthony "Tony" Provenzano and several associates had arranged the killing of Teamsters Local 560 officer Anthony Casalito back in 1961. At the federal level, he was still a person of interest in various racketeering inquiries, and in the minds of FBI agents working the case, a key suspect in the unsolved disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa. But on Mulberry Street that night, he was just one more man coming and going from a club where regulars played cards, drank coffee, and talked. Sometime late in the evening, around 11, 11:00 p.m., Briguglio stepped out onto the sidewalk in front of the Andrea Doria. Accounts differ on whether he was alone or in brief conversation with someone else. But all agree on what happened next. Two men approached him from the street. Witnesses later told police that there was no long argument, no shouted warning. The assailants produced handguns and opened fire at close range, then quickly fled, disappearing into the maze of nearby blocks and traffic. Neighbors called for help, and an ambulance rushed Briguglio to a hospital, but doctors could not save him. Within a short time, he was pronounced dead. The killing had all the hallmarks of a professional hit. It was carried out swiftly, in a public place but under cover of darkness, by assailants who moved with purpose and left no immediate trace beyond scattered shell casings and the shock of bystanders. New York City police and the FBI responded quickly, cordoning off the scene and interviewing anyone who might have seen something. The location and the victim made the crime instantly significant. A suspected mob-connected union enforcer murdered outside a club long watched by organized crime investigators, at a moment when multiple high-profile cases were swirling around his name. Officially, the motive was a mystery. Unofficially, theories sprang up almost immediately. To detectives and agents familiar with the world Briguglio inhabited, several possibilities suggested themselves. One was that he had been killed to prevent him from testifying or otherwise cooperating in the Casalito murder case. As a defendant, he was not expected to testify against others, but in a world where loyalties could shift under pressure, the mere possibility that he might someday decide to share what he knew could be enough to worry those above him. Another theory focused on Jimmy Hoffa. Within the FBI's Hoffa task force, Briguglio had long been treated as a possible participant in or witness to whatever had happened outside the Detroit restaurant in July 1975. His death, coming less than 3 years after Hoffa's disappearance, looked to many like a calculated silencing. There was also the broader context to consider. By 1978, the traditional world of mafia-backed labor racketeering was under sustained assault from law enforcement. New statutes like RICO had increased the potential penalties for those convicted of organizing or participating in criminal enterprises, and the Federal Witness Protection Program had given prosecutors new leverage to flip lower-level participants. Across the country, cases were being built on the testimony of insiders who, facing the possibility of decades in prison, agreed to describe how their organizations worked. Men like Ralph Picardo, whose information had already driven the new Casalito indictments, were showing that the old code of silence could be broken. In that climate, any mid-level figure with detailed knowledge of past crimes could be seen as both a liability and a potential bargaining chip. Murder. Witnesses were either unable or unwilling to provide descriptions strong enough to support an arrest. If there were informants in the relevant circles who knew who had ordered or carried out the hit, they did not, or could not, share that information in a way that produced a prosecutable case. Over time, the killing joined a long list of unsolved, carefully planned homicides associated with organized crime conflicts in New York and New Jersey. For the Casalito case in New Jersey, Briguglio's death had immediate practical consequences. As a defendant, he was removed from the upcoming trial, which proceeded against Anthony Provenzano and the remaining co-defendants. Prosecutors still had Ralph Picardo's testimony and whatever additional circumstantial evidence they had assembled, but one of the key alleged participants in the 1961 killing was now beyond the reach of the courts. Defense attorneys could no longer cross-examine him or attempt to exploit inconsistencies between his statements and Picardo's account. The state would have to tell the story of the alleged conspiracy without ever putting Sally Bugs himself on the stand, even as an adverse witness. Later that same year, New Jersey's effort to hold Provenzano accountable for Casalito's fate finally bore fruit. In 1978, after a lengthy and closely watched trial, a state jury convicted Anthony "Tony" Provenzano of ordering the killing of Casalito. The prosecution's narrative, built largely on Picardo's insider account, described the murder as an internal union power move, designed to remove a rival and consolidate control of Local 560. The verdict sent Provenzano to prison for life. While not every detail of the alleged plot could be independently verified, and while defense lawyers continued to insist that their client had been framed by an unreliable witness, the conviction stood as a major victory for those who had spent years trying to penetrate the lethal side of labor racketeering in northern New Jersey. In an indirect way, Briguglio's absence helped focus public attention on the nature of that world. Journalists covering the trial frequently noted that one of the men accused of physically carrying out the killing had been slain months before in a still unsolved New York shooting. His death became part of a broader narrative. Witnesses and alleged participants in significant organized crime cases were themselves being targeted, sometimes before they could be fully questioned, sometimes while their legal cases were still unfolding. It underscored for many observers the risks faced by anyone enmeshed in that universe, whether as an insider, a dissident, or a prosecutor trying to dismantle the structure from the outside. For the Hoffa investigation, Briguglio's murder was an equally bitter blow. Although the FBI had not been able to assemble enough evidence to charge him in connection with Hoffa's disappearance, agents believed he possessed valuable knowledge. Even if he had not personally been present at any meeting or act of violence, his role within the Provenzano faction and his proximity to key figures made it likely, in their view, that he understood at least some elements of what had happened and why. With his death, one more potential source of answers vanished. The Bureau's task force continued to interview other witnesses, analyze new leads, and test new theories, but a man they had once hoped might, under the right conditions, be pressured into cooperation was now permanently out of reach. The Hoffa case remained, and remains, officially unsolved. In 1982, 7 years after the disappearance, a Michigan court declared Hoffa legally dead, allowing his family to settle his estate and formalizing what had long been assumed. Over the decades, numerous theories have been proposed in books, articles, and documentaries about what exactly happened on that July afternoon in 1975 and where Hoffa's remains might have gone. Some of those theories mention Salvatore, Sally Bugs, Briguglio as a likely participant, or as one of the men involved in luring Hoffa to his fate. Others cast him more as a secondary player, a lieutenant who might have had knowledge but not necessarily a commanding role. Because no definitive physical evidence has ever emerged, and because key witnesses either died or chose not to cooperate, much of this remains in the realm of informed speculation rather than legally established fact. What is beyond doubt is that Briguglio's own death deepened the sense of mystery surrounding the entire constellation of cases. To many in the public, the pattern looked chillingly clear. A powerful union leader vanishes. Years later, one of the men widely suspected of involvement is himself murdered on a city street. Another alleged participant, Anthony Provenzano, goes to prison for life in a different killing. The impression of a closed world settling, its accounts far from the reach of ordinary justice, took hold, feeding both legitimate investigative interest and more sensationalized portrayals in popular culture. Back in New Jersey, the impact of these events on Teamsters Local 560 was profound and long-lasting. The local had already been under heavy scrutiny from both federal and state authorities for years. With Provenzano now serving multiple prison terms and Briguglio dead, the old leadership structure was badly damaged but not entirely dismantled. Allies, relatives, and proteges sought to maintain their positions, arguing that whatever individual officials had done, the union itself remained essential to protecting workers' rights. Reformers within the labor movement and in government, however, increasingly viewed Local 560 as an institution so compromised that only drastic action could correct its course. The federal government's response went beyond criminal trials. In the early 1980s, the U.S. Department of Justice filed a civil RICO lawsuit against Local 560, arguing that it functioned as a racketeering enterprise dominated by organized crime interests. The complaint laid out a history of alleged intimidation, misuse of union resources, and suppression of internal democracy, much of it tied to the years when Provenzano and his lieutenants, including Briguglio, had been most active. While that civil case would unfold fully in the decade after Briguglio's death, the groundwork for it, both in terms of evidence and in public understanding of the problem, was laid in the 1970s, in part through investigations that centered on men like him. Within the ranks of the Union, there was a complicated blend of fear, loyalty, and desire for change. Some members had personally benefited from the aggressive tactics of the Provenzano camp, enjoying relatively good wages and strong benefits in industries where non-union labor often fared far worse. Others had experienced the darker side of that power, pressure not to question leadership, unexplained transfers or job losses after speaking out, and in some cases, direct threats. For the latter group, the removal of figures like Provenzano and Briguglio offered a potential opening for reform, but only if outside authorities could provide enough protection to make participation in that reform seem safe. The broader public conversation about organized crime was also shifting in these years. High-profile prosecutions, combined with widely watched films and television coverage, made terms like RICO, witness protection, and even specific mafia family names part of general vocabulary. In this climate, the story of a New Jersey Teamsters business agent, killed outside a Manhattan social club while under indictment in a decades-old murder case and under suspicion in the Hoffa disappearance, fit easily into a narrative of secret violence and hidden power. Yet historians and serious journalists have often cautioned against seeing it only in those terms. They point out that behind the lurid headlines lay the lives of thousands of ordinary workers whose fates were directly affected by the internal politics of locals like 560, and by the decisions of men such as Salvatore, Sally Bugs, Briguglio. His funeral, like many in that world, attracted a mixture of family, friends, union colleagues, and figures from the underworld. Press accounts describe a ceremony that was outwardly conventional, Catholic rites, floral arrangements, the rituals of mourning, yet shadowed by the knowledge that few in attendance would speak openly to reporters or police about his life and death. For his relatives, he was not only the controversial figure described in newspapers but also a son, a brother, perhaps a husband or father, depending on differing accounts. The historical record, focused as it is on his public and criminal persona, says relatively little about those private relationships. What it records, overwhelmingly, is his role within Local 560 and the Provenzano organization. In that respect, Briguglio's story is emblematic of many mid-level figures in organized crime-linked unions. He rose from a working-class background in an ethnic enclave, found a path to power through labor organizing, and became indispensable to a leader who combined union authority with underworld ties. Along the way, he attracted the sustained interest of law enforcement, was repeatedly named in connection with acts of intimidation and alleged homicides, and ultimately died in a manner that conformed to the lethal logic of the world he had entered. Unlike some, he never became a cooperating witness whose testimony reshaped major cases. Unlike others, he did not simply retire quietly into old age. His life ended at 47, his name attached to unanswered questions in two of the era's most significant criminal investigations. After his death, those questions did not disappear. Investigators re-examined what they knew about his movements before the Hoffa disappearance and before the Casalito killing. They considered whether his murder might provide indirect clues, perhaps pointing to who had the most to gain by silencing him at that particular moment. Over time, leads grew colder, witnesses died or faded from memory, and more urgent cases took priority. Still, in internal FBI analyses and in the recollections of agents who worked the Hoffa case, the killing of Salvatore, Sally Bugs, Briguglio remained a nagging reminder of how much of that history had unfolded beyond their reach, decided by people who understood the costs of speaking and the consequences of knowing too much. In the years that followed, his image would occasionally resurface in books, television documentaries, and, later, feature films that dramatized the world of Hoffa, the Teamsters, and the Mafia. These portrayals varied in accuracy and emphasis, often blending documented fact with conjecture to create compelling narratives. They contributed to a public memory in which names like Hoffa, Provenzano, and Briguglio became almost shorthand for the perceived corruption and danger lurking behind certain forms of post-war American power. Yet behind those broad strokes lies the more granular, historically grounded story. A man shaped by his time and environment, whose choices placed him at the center of some of the most consequential conflicts in modern American labor history, and whose unresolved death stands as both a symptom and a symbol of the era's violent undercurrents. In the months after Salvatore, Sally Bugs Briguglio was killed on Mulberry Street. His name lingered in headlines, courtroom arguments, and law enforcement files. But as the 1970s gave way to the 1980s, he gradually shifted from being an active player in unfolding investigations to something else. A symbol of how deeply one local union in New Jersey had been penetrated by organized crime, and a reference point in the broader effort to remake the relationship between labor and the law in the United States. The Casalito murder case, in which Briguglio had been a central defendant before his death, reached its climax later in 1978 with the conviction of Anthony Tony Provenzano. New Jersey prosecutors had staked a great deal on the testimony of Ralph Picardo, who described a calculated plot to eliminate Casalito as a rival within Teamsters Local 560. In Picardo's narrative, Casalito's death was not a moment of spontaneous violence, but a strategic act intended to send a message to anyone who might consider challenging the Provenzano regime. The jury accepted that account, and Tony received a life sentence. Even without Briguglio present in the dock, his name echoed through the trial. Picardo's account placed him at the center of the operation, and prosecutors pointed to his long-standing role as a loyal Provenzano lieutenant. Defense attorneys, for their part, tried to sow doubt about the state's entire theory of the case by attacking Picardo's credibility, noting that one of the men he accused, Briguglio, was no longer alive to deny or rebut the charges. The court, however, was persuaded that the pattern of intimidation surrounding Local 560 was real, and that Casalito's fate was a central piece of it. For law enforcement, the verdict marked the culmination of a years-long effort to crack the culture of impunity that had surrounded Local 560's leadership. Yet the victory also highlighted the limitations of relying on criminal prosecutions alone. By 1978, the old guard around Provenzano had already begun to fracture under the weight of multiple convictions, deaths, and internal tensions. But the institution itself, the local union that controlled a vital slice of New Jersey's trucking industry, remained in place. Its meeting halls were still open, its contracts still in force, and its membership still numbering in the thousands. The federal government, particularly the Department of Justice's Organized Crime and Racketeering Section, had been grappling with this problem for some time. Traditional prosecutions could remove individual leaders, but others often stepped in to fill the vacuum, sometimes from the same criminal networks. To change the underlying structure, something more far-reaching was required. The tool they eventually settled on for Local 560 was not another criminal indictment, but a civil lawsuit under the same RICO statute that had been used in criminal cases. In 1982, the Justice Department filed a civil RICO action in federal court against Teamsters Local 560, and several of its current and former officers. The complaint portrayed the local as a racketeering enterprise infiltrated and controlled by the Genovese crime family for decades. It did not rely on a single act but on a broad pattern: extortionate dealings with employers, misuse of union funds, rigged elections, and a climate of fear maintained through threats, and in some instances, lethal violence. Among the episodes cited as evidence of this reign of intimidation was the murder of Anthony Casalito, and with it, the network of relationships in which Sally Bugs Briguglio had played a key role. Although Briguglio himself was dead and not a party to the lawsuit, his activities formed part of the historical record on which the government built its case. The government's theory was that the Provenzano group, his relatives, and trusted lieutenants like Briguglio, had, over time, turned the local into a captive institution. Honest union democracy, the Justice Department argued, had been choked off by a mix of patronage and coercion. Members who backed the leadership received steady work and benefits. Those who opposed it risked losing their livelihoods or worse. The pattern in this view was not incidental but systematic. The civil RICO suit was tried in the U.S. District Court for the District of New Jersey before Judge Harold A. Ackerman. Over many weeks, the court heard testimony from former union officials, rank and file members, law enforcement agents, and expert witnesses on organized crime and labor. Government lawyers presented evidence that traced the arc of Local 560's leadership from the 1960s through the 1970s. The rise of Provenzano, the consolidation of his inner circle, the handling of employer negotiations, and the ways in which dissent was reportedly punished. The Casalito murder, as reconstructed through earlier criminal proceedings and investigative records, was a central pillar of this narrative, a dramatic illustration of how far the leadership would allegedly go to eliminate internal opposition. In 1983, Judge Ackerman issued a landmark ruling. He concluded that the federal government had proved its case. Local 560 had indeed been infiltrated and controlled by organized crime figures, and its members had been deprived of their democratic rights through a pattern of intimidation and corruption. As a remedy, he ordered the removal of the local's top officers and appointed an independent trustee to oversee the union's affairs. This was an extraordinary step, the effective takeover of a major American union local by the federal courts in order to root out criminal influence. On appeal, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit largely upheld the district court's findings, reinforcing the idea that RICO could be used not just to punish past misdeeds, but to reshape institutions going forward. In legal commentary and academic writing that followed, the Local 560 case was hailed by some as a model for how to confront organized crime infiltration in labor, and criticized by others as a dangerous expansion of federal power into internal union governance. Either way, the case drew heavily on a factual record in which Salvatore Briguglio's career served as a key example of how labor officials could function simultaneously as union representatives and as enforcers for a criminal enterprise. While these legal battles unfolded, the broader story of the Teamsters Union was also entering a new phase. Throughout the 1980s, federal prosecutors continued to pursue cases against high-ranking Teamsters officials across the country, arguing that organized crime families had used the union as a source of income and influence. These efforts culminated in 1988-1989, when the Justice Department filed a sweeping civil RICO suit against the International Brotherhood of Teamsters itself. The complaint alleged long-standing corruption and mob influence at the highest levels of the union. Rather than litigate that massive case to conclusion, the Teamsters leadership agreed in 1989 to a consent decree. Under its terms, the union accepted federal oversight of its internal elections and the creation of an independent review board to investigate corruption. Although this settlement focused on the international union rather than any single local, the evidence of past abuses in places like Local 560 helped justify the government's insistence that such extraordinary measures were necessary. Once again, the history of Provenzano and his associates, including Briguglio, functioned as part of the backdrop against which policy was being made. By then, Salvatore "Sally Bugs" Briguglio had been dead for more than a decade. The world he had moved through, one in which a single local could be tightly held by a small group of men backed by a powerful crime family, was rapidly eroding under legal pressure and internal change. Many of the figures who had dominated that world either died in prison, retired quietly, or were themselves assassinated in similar fashion. The Teamsters Union, under new leadership and federal monitoring, embarked on a series of reforms designed to increase transparency and distance itself from the legacy of corruption that had haunted it since the Hoffa era. Still, Briguglio's name did not vanish entirely from public consciousness. Each time a new book or documentary revisited the Hoffa disappearance, his reported role as a Provenzano lieutenant, and the persistent rumors that he had been involved in the 1975 plot resurfaced. Journalists often turned to retired FBI agents and prosecutors for comment. Many of those officials, careful not to overstep the bounds of what could be proved, would describe him as a key suspect or person of interest in their investigations, someone they believed knew more than he had ever revealed. They also tended to see his 1978 murder as an act calculated to protect others, either by removing a potential witness or by punishing perceived disloyalty within the ranks. These reflections, however, did little to resolve the central mysteries. Hoffa's remains were never found. No one was ever charged in the disappearance. Rumors of clandestine burials under stadiums, in steel drums, or in remote rural locations have circulated for decades, some of them involving supposed confessions by aging mob figures, others based on imaginative reconstructions of thinly supported leads. In many of these accounts, Salvatore "Sally Bugs" Briguglio appears as a character, sometimes central, sometimes peripheral, but always in a way that blends documented fact with speculation. Responsible historians and investigators are careful to distinguish between what is firmly established and what rests on inference or second-hand reports. The same tension between evidence and legend shapes assessments of Briguglio's life more broadly. On the one hand, there is a solid record of his activities as a business agent for Local 560, his close association with Anthony Provenzano, his repeated presence in investigations of labor racketeering, and the serious allegations, supported by cooperating witnesses, connecting him to acts of violence, including the Casalito murder. On the other hand, much about his personal motivations, his inner thoughts, and the day-to-day details of his work remain opaque. He left no memoirs, no extended interviews, no public attempt to justify or explain his choices. What survives instead are court transcripts, FBI reports, newspaper clippings, and the recollections of others, all filtered through their own perspectives and often their own agendas. Scholars of organized crime and labor have tried to place him within a broader pattern rather than treating him as an outlier. They note that his trajectory, from a working-class Italian-American neighborhood through the ranks of a powerful industrial union into the orbit of a mafia-connected leader, is not unique. The mid-20th century saw many such paths, especially in industries like trucking, construction, and waterfront work, where unions had significant leverage and where informal enforcement was easily absorbed into formal structures. Figures like Briguglio in this analysis are best understood not just as individuals making isolated choices, but as products of a particular economic and social environment in which such roles were both available and, in some circles, admired for their effectiveness. At the same time, Historians resist any temptation to romanticize that environment. Whatever material gains some workers may have enjoyed under hard-line, mob-backed union leadership, the costs, in terms of lost internal democracy, the silencing of dissent, and the use of fear as a managerial tool, were substantial. The murders and assaults that punctuated the history of locals like 560 were not side issues. They were mechanisms by which power was maintained. The fact that someone like Sally Bugs, Briguglio could become both a union official and, according to credible testimony, a participant in lethal enforcement speaks to the depth of that distortion. In the legal and policy realm, his story has become part of the argument for why robust oversight mechanisms are needed to protect unions from capture by criminal elements. The federal trusteeship imposed on Local 560, the later consent decree governing the entire Teamsters Union, and subsequent efforts to monitor and regulate labor organizations are all, in part, responses to the abuses documented in his era. Supporters of these interventions point to cases like his as evidence that, left unchecked, criminal influence can flourish inside institutions that are supposed to represent workers' interests. Critics worry about the potential for overreach and the undermining of union autonomy, but both sides acknowledge that the history cannot be ignored. On a more human scale, the people who worked under Local 560's contracts in the 1960s and 1970s have their own memories of Briguglio and his peers. Oral histories and occasional interviews capture a range of views. Some recall him as efficient, even helpful, in resolving workplace problems. Others remember a man whose presence signaled danger, someone not to be crossed. Together, these accounts suggest a complex figure, neither a one-dimensional villain nor a misunderstood hero, but a man who wielded real power in a system that blended legitimate union representation with coercive control. By the late 1980s and 1990s, as the Teamsters Union changed leadership and the most notorious mob-linked officials receded into history, public interest in figures like Briguglio shifted from immediate concern to retrospective fascination. Books and films revisiting the Hoffa saga, the history of the American Mafia, and the evolution of labor in the post-war period, often used his story as a vivid example of the era's intersections between blue-collar work, organized crime, and politics. The portrayal varied. Some dramatizations exaggerated his role, others downplayed it, but almost all treated his 1978 murder as a stark endpoint, a moment when a man who had long lived in the shadows briefly stepped into public view as a casualty of the very system he had helped sustain. In that sense, the legacy of Sally Bugs Briguglio is double-edged. On one side, he is remembered as an emblem of the worst abuses that can occur when criminal organizations entangle themselves with labor institutions. Intimidation, corruption, and violence used to control both members and employers. On the other, his life story illustrates the broader social forces, economic insecurity, ethnic solidarity, political machines, and the allure of power that made such roles possible and, for some, attractive. Understanding him and the world he inhabited means grappling with both dimensions, the structural conditions that produced him and the individual choices that defined his path. Through the late 1980s and into the 1990s, the institutions that had once defined Sally Bugs, Briguglio's world were being reshaped under pressures he had not lived to see. Federal trusteeship at Teamsters Local 560, ordered on the basis of evidence that included his own career as a Provenzano lieutenant, was no longer a novelty, but a day-to-day reality for the members. Independent administrators began poring over contracts, overseeing hiring hall practices, and monitoring elections. For rank-and-file truckers and warehouse workers, names like Briguglio and Provenzano gradually receded into the background, replaced by unfamiliar figures from the Justice Department and the federal courts. In 1991, the Teamsters Union held its first direct, one-member, one-vote election for international officers under the terms of the 1989 Consent Decree. The winner was Ron Carey, a New York City UPS driver turned reformer who had campaigned on an explicit promise to break with the old culture of corruption and mob ties. His victory was heralded by federal officials and labor reform advocates as a turning point, proof that democratic mechanisms could begin to transform an organization that, in the Hoffa and Provenzano years, had been notorious for backroom deals and outside influence. In this new narrative, people like Salvatore Briguglio appeared not as current power brokers, but as cautionary tales, illustrations of what the Union was trying to leave behind. Yet the past was not easily forgotten. Carey's administration was later tainted by a campaign finance scandal unrelated to organized crime, and he was removed from office in the late 1990s. In 1999, the Union elected James P. Hoffa, son of the missing former president, as its new leader. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. The name, Hoffa, returning to the Teamsters presidency more than 2 decades after Jimmy Hoffa had vanished outside a Detroit restaurant. For those who had followed the original Hoffa's battles with the Provenzano faction, and the subsequent rise and fall of figures like Briguglio, this development added another layer of irony. The son publicly promised that his administration would be clean and compliant with the consent decree, even as he defended his father's historical reputation and called for the government to end its extraordinary oversight. For historians and investigative journalists, the 1990s and 2000s were fertile decades for reassessing the era in which Salvatore Briguglio had flourished. Declassified FBI records, released under the Freedom of Information Act and posted in the Bureau's public archive, offered new glimpses into how agents had viewed the Provenzano Group, Local 560, and the Hoffa disappearance. While many details remained blacked out for privacy or ongoing investigative reasons, the broad strokes were clear. On internal lists of suspects and persons of interest, Briguglio's name appeared alongside those of higher-profile figures from Detroit and New Jersey. Agents repeatedly described him as a close Provenzano aide, an alleged participant in the Casalito murder, and a likely holder of key information about Hoffa. Writers mining these records had to confront the same methodological challenge as the agents who produced them. Much of the material rested on informant reports rather than direct observation. These reports varied in reliability, and some contradicted others. Yet patterns emerged. Multiple sources over several years identified Briguglio as one of Provenzano's most trusted enforcers. Several placed him in discussions about violent solutions to internal disputes. None could definitively tie him to the moment of Hoffa's disappearance, but few discounted the possibility that he knew far more than he had ever revealed to investigators. Books about the Hoffa case and about organized crime and labor repeatedly returned to his story. Dan E. Moldia, whose 1978 study, The Hoffa Wars, had already examined the rivalry between Hoffa and Provenzano, updated his work in later editions and interviews to reflect new information from court cases and FBI files. Moldia, who remained skeptical of sensationalistic claims unsupported by documentary evidence, continued to view members of the Provenzano crew, including Salvatore, Sally Bugs, Briguglio, as central suspects in what he treated as a carefully orchestrated underworld operation to remove Hoffa. He emphasized the pattern of overlapping interests. Detroit mob bosses wary of Hoffa's plans for a comeback, New Jersey allies whose own positions might be threatened by a change in international union leadership, and a network of union men and mob associates accustomed to handling problems decisively and permanently. Other authors advanced different, sometimes conflicting theories. In 2004, former prosecutor Charles Brandt published I Heard You Paint Houses, based on years of interviews with Frank Sheeran, a Philadelphia-area Teamsters official and confessed contract killer. Sheeran claimed that he himself had been the man who shot Hoffa inside a Detroit house, in a plot organized by a combination of Teamsters and mob figures. In Sheeran's narrative, New Jersey actors and men around Provenzano played significant roles. Briguglio appears as one of the tough, feared operatives in that orbit. Brandt's book became one of the most widely discussed accounts of the Hoffa disappearance, in part because it offered a detailed step-by-step description rather than the vaguer hints that had characterized many earlier theories. The Sheeran story, however, has been sharply disputed by other researchers, including some retired FBI agents and journalists like Moldia. Critics point to discrepancies between Sheeran's account and known timelines, forensic evidence, and earlier investigative conclusions. They argue that while he was undeniably involved in criminal violence, his late-in-life confession may conflate or exaggerate events. Within that debate, Salvatore Briguglio's name surfaces as a secondary point of contention. Some readers treat his presence in Sheeran's tale as further evidence of his involvement in Hoffa's fate. Others caution that any narrative framed around disputed testimony must be handled carefully, distinguishing between what can be corroborated and what cannot. Popular culture layered yet another set of interpretations on top of this contested historical record. In 2019, Martin Scorsese's film The Irishman, based on Brandt's book, brought Hollywood's full storytelling power to bear on the intersecting careers of Frank Sheeran, Jimmy Hoffa, and the mob figures around them. In the film, a character based on Salvatore, Sally Bugs, Briguglio appears as one of the New Jersey Teamsters enforcers associated with Provenzano. The movie dramatizes both his role in enforcing union underworld interests and his 1978 murder outside a social club, closely mirroring the basic facts of the real killing while embedding them in Sheeran's version of events. Knowledge remains only partly documented in legal records. Meanwhile, the FBI never closed the Hoffa case. Well into the 2000s and 2010s, agents continued to follow up on tips, evaluate new claims, and in some instances undertake highly publicized searches of properties where Hoffa's remains were said to be buried. A 2004 dig at a horse farm in Milford Township, Michigan, a 2012 excavation at a property in Roseville, a 2013 search of a field in Oakland County, and later efforts at landfill sites and industrial locations, all generated intense media coverage and, ultimately, disappointment when no definitive evidence was found. Each time the case resurfaced in the news, journalists felt compelled to revisit the main suspects and suspected facilitators. Salvatore Sally Bugs, Briguglio's name reappeared in these retrospectives, his 1978 murder cited as a reminder of how many potential witnesses had themselves been removed from the scene. Within organized crime scholarship, the focus gradually shifted from sensational individual cases to broader structural analysis. Researchers examined how changes in law enforcement, economic conditions, and internal mafia dynamics had weakened traditional racketeering rackets. They noted that by the late 20th century, the classic pattern in which a crime family dominated a particular union local through a figure like Provenzano had become less sustainable. Long prison sentences, aggressive use of informants, civil RICO actions, and the erosion of older neighborhood loyalties all made it harder to maintain the kind of tight, fear-based grip that had characterized Local 560 in Briguglio's prime. From this perspective, his career appears as part of a transitional moment. He came of age in an environment where informal power, enforced at times through violence, could easily be translated into formal union authority. He died at the point when that system was beginning to crack under legal pressure, but before its full transformation had taken place. The trusteeship at Local 560, the consent decree over the International Teamsters, and similar interventions in other unions represented a shift from a world where men like him could operate with relative impunity to one where outside oversight significantly restricted their room to maneuver. At the same time, Scholars of labor history have emphasized that the story of corruption and organized crime is only one strand in the broader narrative of the Teamsters and other unions. They point out that during the decades when Briguglio and Provenzano held sway in Local 560, the union did secure real gains for its members: improved wages, pensions, and health benefits in industries that might otherwise have offered far less. This created a complex moral and political landscape. Some members were prepared to tolerate or ignore heavy-handed internal politics as long as the union delivered economically. Others argued that the costs, in lost democracy, in the encouragement of criminal networks, and in the very real harms done to victims of intimidation and violence, were too high. In that debate about trade-offs, figures like Briguglio often stand as shorthand for the darker side of the bargain. The murder of Anthony Casalito, established in court as a crime undertaken to resolve an internal union power struggle, and the unsolved killings and attacks on dissidents in similar locals across the country, underline the human price of allowing organized crime interests to fuse with labor institutions. For the families of people like Casalito, or of Jimmy Hoffa, whose loved ones have never received definitive answers, these are not abstract questions of structure or policy. They are personal losses, forever linked to the actions of men who treated violence as a tool of workplace politics. Italian-American organizations and commentators have also grappled with the legacy of men like Briguglio. For decades, stereotypes that equated Italian heritage with criminality have been used to justify discrimination and suspicion. Many Italian Americans have therefore been keen to emphasize the diversity of their community's experiences and to separate the actions of a small criminal minority from the achievements of millions of law-abiding families. At the same time, some historians within the community insist that confronting the reality of organized crime involvement in unions and other institutions is necessary, if only to prevent romanticization or denial. In this discussion, Briguglio appears as a real, documented participant in criminalized activity, not as an ethnic caricature, but as one man whose choices contributed to both the stigma and the genuine harm. Within the union movement, the story of Local 560 and its enforcers has been used in training sessions and internal education programs as a warning. Reform-minded leaders cite the case as an example of what happens when members lose control of their own organizations, when fear replaces debate, and when outside interests, whether criminal or corporate, distort the union's mission. The point in these contexts is not to dwell on the personalities, but to stress the importance of transparent elections, strong internal checks and balances, and independent oversight when warning signs appear. Even today, decades after Sally Bugs, Briguglio's death, occasional new pieces of information emerge. A formerly sealed court filing is unsealed, a long-retired agent publishes a memoir, or a previously unknown interview with a secondary witness surfaces in an archive. Most of these fragments do not radically change the outline of his story, but they can refine the details. A more precise timeline for a meeting, a phone record that confirms a suspicion, or a personal recollection of his demeanor and methods. Each such addition reminds researchers how much of mid-century labor racketeering history still lies in gray zones, partially documented, partially reconstructed from memory, and always subject to re-evaluation as new sources come to light. Yet the essential contours of his life, as far as the public record reveals them, are now relatively stable. Born into a working-class Italian-American world on the New Jersey side of the Hudson, he rose through the Teamsters ranks to become a business agent and trusted lieutenant to one of the most notorious union leaders of his era. He was repeatedly named in credible testimony as a participant in violent efforts to maintain that leader's control. He drew the sustained attention of law enforcement in both state and federal investigations, was formally charged in at least one union-related killing, and remained a key suspect in one of the 20th century's most famous disappearances. Before the full legal reckoning could play out, he was himself murdered in a fashion consistent with the patterns of the underworld in which he had long moved. Against that backdrop, later media portrayals, however vivid, sit as interpretations layered onto a foundation of hard facts and unresolved questions. Some emphasize his ruthlessness, others his efficiency, still others his place within a larger machine that often left little room for individual moral reflection. The historical record, sparse as it is on his inner life, does not fully answer the question of why he made the choices he did. But it makes clear that those choices had consequences for his victims and their families, for the members of Local 560, for the reputation of the Teamsters Union, and ultimately for himself. Today, the life of Salvatore "Sally Bugs" Briguglio sits mostly in archival boxes and fading memories. His name appears in thick court transcripts, in FBI memoranda written in clipped bureaucratic prose, in newspaper columns shaped by tight deadlines and partial information. On its own, each document is just a shard, a brief mention, a single allegation, a line in a ledger of Union officers. Only when these pieces are assembled does a clearer picture emerge of how one man moved from relative obscurity on the New Jersey waterfront into the glare of some of the most famous criminal investigations in modern American history. What emerges is not a neat morality play with clear heroes and villains, but a story about power, how it is built, how it is protected, and what happens when competing claims to it collide. Briguglio's life unfolded at the intersection of several powerful currents: the rise of industrial unionism, the growth of organized crime, the struggles of immigrant communities for security and respect, and the increasingly determined efforts of the federal government to regulate, and when necessary, dismantle institutions it judged to be compromised. In that sense, understanding him means understanding much more than one man's choices. It means looking closely at the world that made those choices possible. He came of age in the shadow of the Great Depression, in an Italian-American enclave on the New Jersey side of the Hudson River. Economic insecurity was a constant companion there. Jobs were scarce, discrimination against Southern Europeans was common, and the safety net was thin. In such a setting, the emergence of a powerful union like the Teamsters, offering higher wages, more predictable work, and a sense of collective strength, had immense appeal. For many in those neighborhoods, union cards were not just pieces of paper, they were lifelines. But the very features that made unions powerful also made them attractive to people with other agendas. Control over hearing could be turned into a tool for favoritism or punishment. The threat of strikes or slowdowns could be used to extract money from employers as easily as it could be used to demand fair contracts. In places like northern New Jersey, where political machines and mob families were already embedded in local commerce and politics, the line between tough unionism and criminal racketeering proved easy to cross. It was into this gray zone that Salvatore Briguglio stepped when he rose from the rank and filed to become a business agent for Teamsters Local 560. On paper, the job was a legitimate one. He was paid to represent members, handle grievances, and enforce contracts. In practice, according to later court testimony and investigative findings, business agents in locals like 560 also enforced loyalty to leadership, and at times, the unwritten rules of the underworld alliances that supported that leadership. In that dual capacity, as official representative and unofficial enforcer, Briguglio built a reputation among his peers and a profile in law enforcement files. Public records show how tightly his fortunes were tied to those of Anthony "Tony Pro" Provenzano, the local 560 leader and Genovese family associate, whose name became synonymous with the dark side of Teamsters' power. When Provenzano consolidated control of the local in the 1960s, Briguglio was by his side. when federal prosecutors brought extortion cases alleging that trucking companies were forced to pay to avoid labor trouble. Briguglio was among the defendants. When New Jersey authorities, spurred by the cooperation of insider Ralph Picardo, finally moved to bring charges in the long unsolved 1961 disappearance of Local 560 officer Anthony Casalito, Briguglio again found himself under indictment, accused of taking part in a murder carried out to resolve an internal union power struggle. The record is clear that he denied those charges and refused to cooperate with investigators. In grand jury appearances and courtroom hearings, he invoked his constitutional rights rather than answer detailed questions about Provenzano, about Casalito, or about Jimmy Hoffa. Yet the accusations did not fade. Picardo's testimony, combined with other investigative material, convinced a New Jersey jury in 1978 that Casalito had in fact been killed on Provenzano's orders. By the time that verdict was reached, Briguglio himself was already dead, shot outside the Andrea Doria Social Club on Mulberry Street in Manhattan in a killing that bore the hallmarks of a planned underworld execution, and that has never been solved. That death froze his public image in time. From that moment forward, Salvatore "Sally Bugs" Briguglio could not change his story, cut a deal, or offer his own account of events. He became, instead, an object of interpretation. To law enforcement veterans looking back on their cases, he was the quintessential key suspect who had eluded full accountability. To writers and filmmakers eager to untangle the mysteries surrounding Hoffa's disappearance and Teamster mob ties, he was a vivid character whose real life, dangerous, secretive, unresolved, invited dramatization. To members of his family and community, he was something more complex, a relative or neighbor whose public notoriety may have sat uneasily alongside private memories. In retrospect, it is tempting to treat his trajectory as inevitable, a boy from a rough neighborhood drawn into a rough trade, moving naturally toward the role of mob-linked union enforcer. But that temptation should be resisted. Hundreds of thousands of Italian Americans grew up in similar circumstances and chose different paths, including many who became union leaders without entangling themselves with criminal networks. The forces of economic necessity and ethnic solidarity were powerful, but they did not dictate a single outcome. They created a field of possibilities within which individual decisions, Briguglio's included, mattered. At the same time, focusing only on personal choice risks obscuring the structural realities that made certain choices attractively rewarded. When union democracy is weak, when oversight is minimal, and when alliances between political machines and illicit organizations go unchallenged, someone willing to blend intimidation with organizational skill can advance quickly. The evidence assembled in the Local 560 Civil RICO case, which drew heavily on the era in which Briguglio served as a business agent, suggests precisely such a dynamic. A local captured over time by a small group whose power rested as much on fear as on formal authority. From a policy perspective, his story helped spur reforms that extended well beyond New Jersey. The trusteeship imposed on Local 560 signaled that the federal courts were willing to take unprecedented steps to protect union members' rights when internal mechanisms had been subverted. The later consent decree over the entire Teamsters Union, with its supervised elections and independent review boards, underscored that willingness on a national scale. While many factors contributed to these developments, the documented record of violence, extortion, and intimidation in Provenzano's Local 560, much of it carried out by or through trusted operatives like Briguglio, provided powerful support for the argument that outside intervention was justified. Culturally, the fascination with his world has outlasted the precise details of his biography. The names of people and places associated with his story, Hoffa, Provenzano, Local 560, the Andrea Doria Social Club, have become touchstones in American discussions about organized crime. They stand for something larger than themselves, for the belief that beneath the surface of ordinary institutions there can exist hidden networks of obligation and coercion. Films like The Irishman, television documentaries, and an entire subgenre of true crime literature draw on this reservoir of meaning, even when they take dramatic liberties. For historians, the challenge is to walk a careful line between acknowledging that resonance and insisting on evidence. In the case of Salvatore Briguglio, that means accepting that some questions may never be answered with certainty. Did he personally participate in Hoffa's disappearance, or did he simply know more than he ever said publicly? Who ordered his killing on Mulberry Street, and what specific fear or grievance lay behind it? Were there moments when he considered breaking with the world he had helped sustain? The available record does not allow us to say definitively. What it does allow is a grounded assessment of the roles he unquestionably played. As a union official with real influence over workers' lives, as a trusted lieutenant in a mob-linked faction, as a repeated subject of serious criminal allegations, and as a victim of the same violent system that he had long served. For the people most directly affected by that system, the consequences were concrete. Anthony Casalito never came home in 1961. His family waited years for answers, and even after Tony Pro's conviction, had to live with the knowledge that some participants and details would remain officially unconfirmed. Jimmy Hoffa's family endured a similar, even more public, limbo, marked by waves of speculation and false leads. Rank-and-file members of Local 560 who ran afoul of Provenzano's camp, or who simply wanted a more open internal culture, faced the daily calculation of whether speaking up was worth risking their jobs or their safety. In each of these situations, men like Salvatore, Sally Bugs, Briguglio were not abstract villains. They were the flesh and blood actors who, by action or omission, helped make certain outcomes more likely. Responsibility. Employers who chose to treat extortion as a cost of doing business rather than reporting it. Politicians who looked the other way in exchange for campaign contributions or votes, and union members who accepted patronage while ignoring abuses, all played roles in sustaining the environment in which he thrived. The system was larger than any one enforcer. When we step back, the arc of his life traces many of the tensions that defined mid-20th century America. There is the hopeful story of working-class organization, workers banding together to demand better treatment from employers. There is the darker story of how those vehicles of empowerment could themselves be captured and used as instruments of exploitation by criminal groups. There is the state's response, sometimes timid, sometimes overbearing, struggling to strike a balance between protecting rights and preventing abuse. And running through it all is the individual story of a man who chose, again and again, to align himself with a regime that enforced its rule not just by the strength of its arguments, but by the shadow of what might happen to those who resisted. By the time federal oversight began to loosen its hold on the Teamsters in the early 21st century, the world that had produced Salvatore, Sally Bugs, Briguglio was already fatting. The old waterfront haunts had been redeveloped. The industrial landscape of northern New Jersey had changed, and the organized crime families that once dominated those spaces had been weakened by decades of prosecutions and internal decline. New forms of labor organization and new challenges, globalization, automation, the decline of stable industrial jobs, occupied the attention of workers and unions alike. Yet the lessons of his era did not disappear. Contemporary debates about corruption, accountability, and the proper relationship between unions and the state continue to invoke the history of locals like 560. When allegations arise today about misconduct in labor organizations, corporate boards, or government agencies, reformers often point back to cases such as Briguglio's, arguing that early intervention and strong oversight are essential to prevent the kind of entrenched, fear-based power he embodied. Skeptics of expansive government power, in turn, sometimes reference the same history to warn against tarring entire institutions with the crimes of a subset of leaders, or against using exceptional cases to justify broad, long-term controls. In that ongoing conversation, the figure of Sally Bugs persists as something more than a supporting character in the Hoffa saga. He is a reminder that institutions are made and remade by human choices, that the line between representing workers and exploiting them can be crossed in subtle ways long before it is crossed in dramatic ones, and that the costs of allowing clandestine power to grow inside public-facing organizations are often paid by people who never appear in headlines. On a March night in 1978, those dynamics converged on a single sidewalk outside a club on Mulberry Street, when a man whose life had been spent in the shadows was abruptly, violently removed from the stage. His death did not resolve the mysteries that surrounded him. It did not, in itself, reform the union he had served or bring justice to all his alleged victims. But it did crystallize, in one stark image, the perils of a world in which questions of wages and pensions could become entangled with questions of life and death. Looking back now, with the advantage of distance and documentation, we can see his story not as an isolated tale of crime, but as part of the larger history of how modern America wrestled with the twin forces of collective organization and private power. Salvatore, Sally Bugs, Briguglio walked that contested ground for less than 50 years. The institutions he touched, the people he affected, and the unsolved cases that still bear his name have outlived him by decades. They continue to raise the same fundamental questions that framed his era. Who controls the levers of power in a democracy, how they are held to account, and what happens when those entrusted to protect the vulnerable instead ally themselves with those who rule by fear.